My channel is now called Kev Binge. It's way easier and I'll be doing more than just Blender going forward. Like, no one cares. That said, I watch Netflix and there's this show on there that has this meat monster in one of the seasons. I'm a huge fan of that show, so I thought I'd create a monster that's heavily inspired by it. I usually work in industrial, social, and now biotech, but this was a fun challenge for me. Here are my results in creating the Mind Flayer thingy. I first give kudos to the actual effects teams that pulled this thing off. I'd read that at one point there were 200 artists on that show, so I assume more than one artist worked on this thing. That said, here's my attempt to recreate an iconic monster from a default cube. I'd started with Blender because it's a really good modeling app. I fell back on my Lightwave roots with box modeling. I give massive props to William Vaughn. You don't remember 2002 New York City, but you sat with me for like 2 solid hours and recreated my workflow, so thanks, man. I use loop, cut, and slide, then pull out things until I get the shape I want. Form is everything. Without that, you have suck, and suck just, like, sucks. I took the default cube, stretched it out, and added some cuts using loop, cut, and slide. I'd go into every shortcut here, but the video would be longer than a pandemic, and we hate that, so let's continue. I use box modeling here to rough out the form of the meat monster thing. I'd show a reference, but like copyright. Extrude and pull until you get the shape you want. Control R is a great shortcut for loop, cut, and slide. Once you model more, you'll feel it, and you'll know where to cut. There are thousands of videos about modeling in Blender on YouTube now. Thousands. If you don't know how to model, any one of those can help you. My personal favorite tools are extrude and loop, cut, and slide. I'm literally doing this all with just that and moving points around with the different orthographic views. 1, 2, and 3 on the keyboard will switch between point, edge, and face select in edit mode. Tab gets you into edit mode, and box select is what I'm using here. At various points, I decided to delete half this thing, then add a mirror modifier from the modifiers panel. This allows you to work on one half while the other is just mirrored. Another cool trick I'm using here for the leg extrusions is setting individual origins. When I extrude and scale these parts, they will scale down by themselves, not together. Try it, you'll love it. Just remember that it's on when things don't work the way you're used to later. The rest of this is just extruding and pushing and pulling until I got what I wanted. Once in a while, I'll add in a Subdivision surface modifier to see what this thing actually looks like. It helps to visualize where you're going, not where you've been. Life lessons. With Subdivision on, if you hit Tab to go back into edit mode, you can push and pull just a few points and see the whole thing move. It's a nice workflow to just block out the form. Sure, there are so many different ways you can model, and you've no doubt watched them all. So yeah, I could have done this a million different ways. I don't really care. This worked for me, and it was great. So as you work more, you'll understand, and if you're pro, you'll already get it. I spent a little bit of time here on the head just to split the mouth part out. It's like a piece together thing, so I made it so. All just extruding and pushing and pulling, nothing too special. I did the same thing with the pointy head thingies. After spending way too much time pushing and pulling, I copied the model so that I could still have the original working file. And on the new one, I applied the mirror and Subdivision surface modifiers. This allowed me to take it into Sculpt, where I messed it up more, because it's meat. It's like rats and people, like, who cares? I switched over to the Sculpting tab and sculpted a bit. I really just used the first icon because it was there, and I just wanted blobs and crap, not ArtStation bragging rights. I left symmetry on for a while, just for laziness sake, but I eventually turned it off so I could get some variation. That's when I went to work on the head part. Now, all meat monsters have sinew. Those tough strands of meat that get stuck in your teeth. You know, the ones that you play with all night until you can floss? Yeah, those. I wanted to have lots of that stuff. So I selected polygons and used bridge edge loops. That connects them together. I then went in and used loop, cut, and slide, then scaled them down a bit to make them more stringy. I basically did that all over the place. Another thing you can do is if you have selected faces that are on opposite sides of the mesh, you can bridge edge loops and it'll make a hole through your mesh. I did this in a number of places too. It makes the meat more, like, gross or something. So once I was happy adding in all that stuff, I subdivided it again, applied it, and went back into Sculpt to mess it up more. I also saved another version. It's a good idea so that you can go back to previous versions. Houdini is great at this, but Blender, not so much yet. Here I added a matte cap shader, so it looks like ZBrush. I only did this for you in this video, so it makes me look cool and sexy and stuff. Just kidding, it helps me see the topology better for some stupid reason I'll never understand. Now it's time for the bones. Every meat monster needs bones sticking out. I could model them, but screw that. I'll grab some from the Smithsonian website. They have like 1 million bones that some poor soul scanned. Yeah, I bet it was like his or her job for like a year. Like, you learn photogrammetry and scan this pile of death. Then you'll get a promotion to like assistant curator. They were like, yeah, whatever. I'm gonna take the money and run. So I found bones, and the site said I can use them for free. So here we go. They were in PLY format, so naturally Blender can import them perfect. No, they were super high res. They needed to be reduced. I found that the remesh modifier has more power than making stupid cube videos, and I could use it to do a voxel remesh. Since I don't need these to be too high res at all, I set the voxel size to like 4 meters and hit apply. There, much lower res, and it still holds the shape. I did these with the other bone models too, until I had what I wanted, like a friggin' elephant graveyard. At this point, I just wanted to stuff them into the model, so I did. I copied, pasted, and placed them where I wanted them until I was happy. There's no right or wrong way to do this here. It's fiction, like made up stuff, so yeah. I copied, pasted, rotated, scaled, blah. There, it was fine. I then scaled all of it and hit Ctrl-J to join it into one object. This thing needed teeth. Seriously, have you ever met one of these things that didn't have teeth? No, you haven't. I made these out of cubes that I loop cut and scaled and shaped. I added a subdivision modifier, then applied it once I was happy with the shape. They're all canines, so like pointy and whatever. I placed them all over the mouth perimeter until I was happy. Then I looked at reference, and this thing has a secondary mouth inside the main one. So I went back in and sculpted a secondary mouth. After that, I had to assign different shaders to the bones and teeth. I joined what needed to be joined and then assigned different shaders to it all. One cool trick here is to assign a shader to one thing and then select the other things you want that shader assigned to, making sure the one with the shader is the last selected, then go Object, Make Links, Materials. Now they all have the same one. You can also join them first and assign a shader. It's your call on that one. I'm not here to tell you how to live. Now, I wanted this thing to be able to move. This isn't a still image, so I wanted to flex my amazing animation talent. Just kidding, I'm mediocre, but I needed a rig. I could find one online, but that took too much time, so I built one from scratch. I started with a bone in the middle by adding an armature. That's bones in Blender. They're called armatures. I made one bone, then went into edit mode and hit E, then extruded out more bones to the shape of this dude. I added enough bones so that when I create the link, the teeth will hold and the mouth will open, and I won't have to do too much weight painting later, because I hate that. I added lots of bones. Try it, it works. Once I had the torso down, I needed to rig the legs. I also needed these things to stick to the ground and be able to move the torso without the legs going through the floor. That will take IK, which I'll go into in a bit. Be patient, and let's move along the song and try to find the plot. I was in edit mode and hit Shift A. That makes a new bone separate from the chain, without creating a new armature. I moved that bone into position on the right leg base, then extruded it all the way to the whatever the feet are on a meat monster. I also moved the bones into position. Then here, I drew one bone that will be the controller bone. I'll use this later to move the legs. Now I rename the bones. Now, front leg .r. The .r is important as we will symmetrize this later, and the R's will change to L's for the left side. If you don't do this, no one can help you. You'll be stuck in suck forever and have a whole lot more manual work to do. I'll show you later. So I made the rest of the right side leg bones, naming them appropriately. Front leg.r, middle leg.r, back leg.r. If you do that from the first bone, the ones you extrude will carry the R down the chain and make things much easier for you. So once these guys are drawn out, I needed to make them work. I selected the ankle bone on the front right leg, then went to Bone Constraint Properties and added an Inverse Kinematics constraint. You'll see what that does in a minute. I set the chain length until the dotted line was at the first bone in the leg chain. Then set target to be armature, bone to be front control bone, and then, with the control bone selected, hit Alt-P to clear parent. Now it worked. I tested it, and yep. However, if I move the root, the ankle holds, but the stupid foot thing rotated. So I went into the bone properties and unchecked inherit rotation for the bones that came after the ankle. There, problem solved. Dance of joy. I also decided that I'd like to be able to move the knees as well. So I need another controller bone. Here's where I'd realize the power of the otherwise annoying 3D cursor. If you select a knee bone in edit mode, then hit Shift S and choose cursor to selected, you can now hit Shift A and grow a bone from the exact position of the knee bone, where the 3D cursor is. That was super cool. I did that for 3 legs and then named them all pole. I said pole. To make them work and control the knees, I tested it on the front leg. I selected the ankle bone, then went back to constraint properties, and for pole target, I chose the armature. And for bone, I chose pole bone for the front leg. It looked messy, so I rotated the pole angle until I was happy, and then tested it. It's nice. If you do this, start small on one chain until you understand how it works. Keep going until you get it. You will get it. I mean, I think you will. Now I just repeated the entire thing for each of the other 2 legs and got them working. Then I select the 3 roots and then the main hip bone last, hit parent and chose keep offset. Now they are parented to the main hip bone. Now, here's where the naming of the R came in. I selected the whole armature and went to armature, symmetrize. Bam! It gave me a nice duplicate mirror and the legs were all rigged. Nice shortcut. I dropped into pose mode to test this out and moved the main hip bone and yep, nice results, except for the front leg bone, which I messed up and didn't name it with an R. Oopsies. I undid the symmetrize, renamed the front leg bones with an R, hit symmetrize again, and it worked. I love it when a plan comes together. I also reworked the bones on the front other leg because the model on that side needs less bones. Look at that. All right. I ended up creating a master bone in edit mode by hitting Shift A in edit mode, then parented the hip bone to that one so I could have an easier to find control. I'd also parented all the pole bones to the master bone too. It just makes things easier later. With all that done, it was time to link the bones to the model. To do that, I just selected the model, then the armature, all in object mode, and hit Control P for parent. I chose automatic weights, and being that I'd placed enough bones where I'd wanted them originally, I was pretty confident this would work. I tested the rig in pose mode after parenting it, and yep, it worked without the need to go and do crazy weight painting or even use auto IK, which some of you were like, duh, why don't you just use that? I'll tell you why, because it sucks down the line, that's why. I'd realized too late that I'd wanted some stringy saliva stuff in his mouth when he opens up to say, ah. So I unparented the bones, went back in and did more bridge edge loop stuff, then reparented the bones. Not bad. This project is up on my Patreon if you want it. Truth be told, I was getting tired of looking at a dull model, so I went in to texture it. I kept it simple. UV work takes a while, and I wanted to get this out, so I chose to use generated for the coordinates. I also used a Musgrave with a color ramp and some meaty colors like dark red and off-white for marbleization. You know, that which gives a meat monster its flavor? You've never even eaten one. Don't even front. I played around with that setup until I'd got something I liked. I added in a bump map too, tied to the Musgrave texture. I'd also multiplied another level above that for some variation using a mixed color node. I like doing this for fun, but it would look better UV mapped with some like ground beef and slime painted onto it, probably. I also added some variation to the roughness to break up the highlights and the shine. Next, I gave the teeth an off-white shader with a Musgrave giving it random blood splotches. Again, better painted, but like whatever for now. I also gave the bones an off-white color and made the saliva clear with its own shader. Great, meat monster done for now. Now I needed a place to put it. Originally, I wanted to put it in a basement with some fog and stuff, but the rendering was taking way too long, so I decided to ruin a nice holiday scene in London. I went to pexels.com and found a really nice shot that's CC0 from George Morina. Thanks, George. Sorry to ruin your video, man. I grabbed a still image and went into FSpy. This is a cool program that lets you draw out lines and extrapolate camera data. I kind of suck at it, but I was able to get something close. You can save out the FSpy file and open it in Blender if you grab the add-on from the fspy.io website link. Now you can import the FSpy file and it will bring in the camera and the image background. Sweet. I decided to place my creature in there and begin animating. I wanted an establishing shot of about 2 seconds, so I raised him up in edit mode and keyframed him above the camera. It's a locked off shot, so I didn't have to worry too much about tracking at all. I went about 4 to 8 frames out and had him land on the ground, then keyed him there. Then I went into pose mode and began animating the secondary action of him slamming into the ground. Using the main bone, I could bring him all the way up while his feet stayed anchored, then slam him all the way down into the floor a few moments later. In pose mode, you hit I, and I usually chose whole character, selected bones only. This made things easier later, as I'd only had a few bones to animate, because I'd set up my own non-auto IK rig. I kept going. Usually I'd block out keyframes with a constant interpolation on in the graph editor and go pose to pose, but this was quick and dirty, so I did a bunch of straight ahead animation. I kind of got in the flow and it was working, so I just went with it. I kept tweaking it until it looked like he had some weight when he hit. This thing probably weighs a ton, so I wanted it to look like that as best I could in a short amount of time. After I was okay with the fall, it was time for some contemplation. Whenever a meat monster falls, he has to take a moment to get his bearings. Here, I added some anticipation and follow-through. I'm rusty on the character stuff as I mostly work in non-sexy industrial stuff, but it began coming back to me. At some point here, I'd also changed the look of the bones to blocks in the bone settings because it was less annoying on screen. It was just a personal choice. Next, I wanted it to advance on the camera, so I made it do a step forward. This thing is basically a spider, so I looked for spider locomotion references online. You'd be surprised how little of that there is. I know, I was shocked too. Once I found something, I faked it and made it step forward using Meat Monster logic. It's fake, but it still obeys physics. I'd spent the next hour animating this guy. I really didn't want to go over like 7 hours for this whole shot, so I kept it like whatever. Once I was happy, I made it open its stupid mouth and roar. You won't hear it because I hate hearing bad sound design, and I'm not that good at it yet. Imagine it's a roar. It'll still be better than 90% of the sound on Instagram. After looking at the motion, I decided I wanted to retime certain parts and speed others up. Here is where going straight ahead animation failed me. Or did it? It turned out that I could use non-linear animation in Blender. This is a menu item in the window. It basically rolls all your animation into an editable clip. From here, you can cut and rescale your animation like you do with video. Sweet! I spent some time in here and was happy. Lastly, it was time to add some drool. Now, drool in any 3D software is crazy. If you listen to Andrew Kramer, it's almost impossible for all but the hallowed effects artists in Hollywood. He sells keyed out slime. I didn't use that. I went the other way because I'm like a masochist or something. I saved the entire rig and armature out as an alembic file and brought it into Houdini. This program is crazy, and I've been using it professionally for the last few years, but it's so deep and I'd never done a fluid simulation like this before, so like naturally I jumped in. In Houdini, I added in a geo node. Once I dove inside of that, I threw down an alembic node and loaded in my alembic file from Blender. I named it ABC before, so it showed up here. Hey look, it's the meat monster with all the animation. Great. I set the frame range to 216 like it is in Blender, then went to work on the simulation. Now, the trick to using alembic and getting at the geometry in Houdini is to set load as on the parameter pane to unpack alembic delayed load primitives. You also have to set no polysoup primitives. Now you can access faces. Being that I didn't want the whole thing to emit fluid because I respect rainforests and the planet and like my industrial strength hairdryer is broken, I only wanted to emit from his tonsil area or whatever. I chose some faces in the back of his throat, then hit tab and used the split sop. That gave me just what I wanted to emit fluid from. I added a null named emit out of the split sop and added another null called collide out of the alembic source. Now I created another geo node, then threw down an object merge inside. I called in the split geometry emit, then selected the geometry, went to the dreaded shelf tool, and chose emit particle fluid. I could have done this in the network editor, but I was lazy. Next, inside the created auto-dop network, I selected the fluid object node and resized the container. You don't want to simulate voxels you don't need to. It's a waste and it'll take way longer than you ever want your computer to be running. I set particle separation to 0.04 as I thought it might be enough, and set viscosity to 150 in the physical tab. That should make it gooey, like I want it to be, because you know it's like meat and goop and slime. Next, on the flip solver node, I added an ID attribute in case I needed it later for retiming. Turns out I didn't, but it didn't add that much more to memory. Then, under volume motion, I enabled viscosity because, well, slime. Now I wanted collision with the monster. So in the AutoDop network, I added in a static object and called in the collider from before. I also made sure to check deforming geometry so it behaves with the movement. Lastly, I'd wired it into the merge node. Now it should work. Once I thought I had something that might work, as is the case with most of this stuff, I baked out the sim from the output node. If you choose save to disk in the background, you could monitor it in the render manager. I did this. Once that cooked, I went into the particle fluid node and did the same thing on the compressed cache. Then I went and got coffee. When I came back, I had some decent splashing cached. I checked the meshing on the render null and yeah, it looked okay. I scrubbed some frames and decent. Time to write it out as an alembic file. After the render node inside the particle fluid node, I added an alembic ROP and told it where to save, and saved it as slime point ABC. I could have done a flipbook in Houdini, but I wanted to see if this would even come into Blender. It did. I did some tests and shaded it. It looked decent, but I wanted to further refine it. So I went back and forth like 5 times until I got the fluid looking okay. It turned out that I needed the simulation to run at double speed, probably due to the scene scale that I didn't set in the beginning of the Houdini session. You live and you learn. Now it was time to light this thing and render it. Looking at the footage, I placed the lights where they are in the frame and tweaked them until I was satisfied. I'd used 3 area lights, one for each shop window and one for the huge blue glow in the background. I'd spent some time blocking this out. It's not optional, but it works if you work it. I think I also added a light above. Next, I wanted something to reflect in the monster and slime. I chose to wrap the scene in an HDRI image that loosely matched the business of this scene. I then changed the colors of the HDRI to match the colors in the background plate. I wasn't concerned too much with the lighting, but wanted something to reflect. It's a super fake, but seemed to look decent and add a tiny bit of fill light and reflection. Next, I'd built a rough approximation of the backplate with simple grids, then did a UV project from camera onto it. I'd added an image to it and it was now reflecting in the meat as well as picking up shadows from the monster. Not too bad. I wasn't too concerned with extruding out all the detail in the buildings, but it wouldn't have hurt. I then set the fake set to be a shadow catcher in the object properties for cycles, and rendered it out with lots of passes turned on, like ambient occlusion, depth, and a host of other things I didn't end up using but sucked my memory. Blender has a nice compositor, but I like Fusion a bit better, so I decided to use Davinci Resolve in Fusion. Once I loaded up the background video, I dragged it into the timeline, right-clicked on it, and said, Open in Fusion page. This throws it into Fusion. Once you're in there, you can drag and drop your renders from Blender into the composition. Here it's nodes like Blender and Houdini. You hook things up to each other. I'd started with a reflection pass I'd rendered out of Blender. I didn't need it, but brought it in. The footage was also larger than the renders out of Blender, so I added a resize node first. Then I'd added in the monster footage. I'd made sure to choose the correct layer. All of the Blender Cycles passes are in this list. I chose Combine for now. Now in Fusion, the renders come in dark. One way to fix this is to use Blender's Filmic LUTs. There are other better ones, but this one worked for me here. I added in an OCIO color space node, and from there loaded in the config.ocio from the Blender install folder. I set source space to linear and output space to Filmic sRGB. That did the trick. Are there other ways? Many. Did I care? No. Then I added an emerge node and plugged it in. I also used a multiply node before this one to add in a reflection pass. I took it out later, so it's not important here. From here, I added in a color corrector node and attempted to blend it into the background. I know there are better 3D ways to bring this all together, but this is quick and dirty, and I don't have the 3D stuff unlocked yet in Fusion because I'm waiting for version 17 to drop. Once I was okay with this and checked the shadow blacks, the scopes, etc., I added a very light depth blur to it using the depth blur node and another loader with the render footage set to the Z-depth pass layer. That gave me something okay. I tried to match the blur in the midground of the image too. I got close, but I probably could have gotten closer. Lastly, I added some very slight film grain over the whole thing to blend in with the noise of the video. Just a hint of it seemed to help. Finally, I added a glow over the top to pop it out a bit, then color corrected it with Resolve's awesome color grading tools. And here it is. Not too bad for like 7 hours minus stupid sim times. Subscribe so I could do this full time and get a Threadripper. There are lots of things I'd add to blend this better, and probably do some vellum sims or add some lattices to the rig to make it jiggle a bit. That and adding some subsurface scattering would really help, but that was taking forever to render. I'd also clean up the animation, timing overlap, and wait a bit. It also needs some camera shake. I could pixel screw this thing forever, but I'm happy for less than 10 hours of work, I guess. The scene is up on Patreon, and if you felt you got anything out of this video, hit subscribe. I'd love to have you as part of the channel. Thanks. Stay chill. Bye.